Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to another featured speaker for the 2017 Tiny House Summit. Darren Hughes is here from Tiny House Australia. Darren, welcome.
Good morning. How you doing? Well, it's morning my time. It's 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning. So good morning. Thanks for having me.
How are you going?
Yeah, we've worked it out. I'm going good, mate. How you going?
My small concession to colloquial Australian language. Hey, let's have you tell your story. Who are you and what do you do?
Who am I? Look, I'm this is the face behind the guy that's behind Tiny Houses Australia. Look, I came across Tiny Houses probably about 4 years ago now. You know, a lot of people sort of that know me sort of have heard my story, but I was in a situation where I guess like a lot of people that have come in, everyone sort of comes to the tiny house movement and concept through different paths and different means. But I was in a situation where, you know, I could see my marriage was coming to an end. Okay, what am I going to do? I'm going to be going into another phase of my life. And I looked at options like renting. I'll move out and get my own little apartment, my own little micro small studio apartment, because it's just going to be me. I'm not going to need much. But those sort of things are only in the middle of the city and they're really, really expensive. I thought, well, that's not practical. And I didn't want to go down the road of saving up and getting into a massive mortgage again and a massive debt. So I looked at things like buying a caravan, or as you guys call them, travel trailers, and living in that while I got back on my feet. And I was online one night and it's sort of going down the rabbit hole that is the internet, and I spotted and I remember the exact house. It was Proto House, Anne Holly's house. I think it's Anne Holly, Proto House online. And I saw this image and I thought, what's that? And I looked into it and followed the link. And the more that I looked into it, the more that it just made sense. And I thought, hang on, this makes sense. This is actually a good option for me. And the more I looked into it, the more it made sense. And I thought, I can't be the only one that would make sense of this once I saw it. And when I looked further, there was lots of information. Even back then, there was still quite a lot of information online about the tiny house movement in the States, but nothing really in Australia. And so I started the Tiny Houses Australia Facebook page mainly as a bit of a scrapbook of ideas for my build, my personal project. Little did I know that, you know, 4 years later we'd have, you know, 41,000 followers and being invited to speak at different events and being interviewed for things like a Tiny House Summit. So it's been an interesting 4 years.
Yeah. Why do you think there's a growing interest in tiny houses in Australia?
Look, I think it's probably very similar to many other parts of the world. There's the tiny house movement's growing in New Zealand. Obviously, it's well established in the States, but all throughout Europe. I'm connected online with tiny house people, you know, in many parts of the world. And the common thread is that people are starting to realize that life is short, and they're starting to realize that what's it all about? Is life all about working our guts out, you know, 30, 40, 50 hours a week in a job that we probably don't like, to pay for a mortgage that's giving us that much financial pressure that we haven't got the time to do the things that we love. We don't have time and space to spend time with those we care about. So I think for a lot of people, it's a shift, and people are realizing that, okay, let's hit the reset button. Let's slow down. What are we doing? We want to spend our life doing the things we love. We'll spend more time doing the things we love, or perhaps have the opportunity to go do a job that we really like, which might be maybe lower paid. You know, so I think that's one of the main reasons. So it's a cost thing, which is the main reason for people in Australia. Sort of secondary, and there's sort of three main reasons. I think the second reason being that the environmental and sustainability side of things. You know, obviously a tiny house just has a smaller impact on the planet. You know, as I was saying in Sydney at the home show, you know, with a tiny house anywhere in the world, if you need to up and move, you hook it up and you tow it away, and 2 days later, once you're gone, there's no trace of ever having been there. So the sustainability and environmental side of things is a big one, and the third one is kind of that emotional, getting back to what's life all about, and sort of connecting with yourself and finding out who am I, what am I doing in life, and just sort of hitting the refresh button, if you know what I mean. So there's several reasons, but I think it's a similar line of thinking to what's happening in other places around the world as well.
So here in the States, every once in a while driving, I'll actually see a tiny house on the road. Do you ever see them in Australia?
No, that'd be freaky. I'm looking forward to the first time I do. I remember the very first time I went and saw a tiny house, because the thing is, when I first started the Tiny Houses Australia page, there was one tiny house in the country that I knew of, and that was up the other end of the country. But now there's about 60 to 70 builds that we know of that are either complete or underway in Australia. Now, it doesn't seem like much, but you got to remember that Australia's only got about 26 million population, not 300-400 million that the US has. So it's a much smaller population, but out of the 60 or 70 that we know of, that's only the ones that have said, hey, I'm on Instagram, here's my blog, here's my Facebook page or my YouTube channel. I guarantee there'll be hundreds more that are just under the radar, being built by people that just want to get on with it. That suits us. We're going to build it. We're not worried. We're not interested in documenting it. We're just going to build it. We're just going to build it and reap the benefits thereof. So, but there is several in Melbourne. You never really see one on the road because in Australia, one of the main differences between America and Australia is that, and I was speaking about this with Michelle on the Tiny House podcast last weekend, but in America, a lot of the tiny houses are really quite heavy because they're a house. They're a house on a trailer, and they're built solid because it's a house. And an example was a lady came to us recently, because here in Australia we actually sell custom tiny house trailers. We don't have a building business as yet, but we do have a really great manufacturer here in Melbourne that does our Tiny Houses Australia trailers. And one lady came to us for a trailer quote, and she said, I've bought Andrew and Gabriella Morrison's tiny house plans. I thought, great, it's a beautiful house. I love that place. And she said, so I need a trailer that's going to suit their plans. And here's their plans. So she sent me sort of a few pages of their plans. And I looked at it, and with no disrespect to Andrew and Gabriella, because I love them dearly and I love their place, but if you build that house to spec as per their plans, that's 17,000 pounds in weight. And that's about 7.5 ton here in Australia. Now, the absolute maximum that you'll get on the road in Australia is 4.5 tons. So in order to build something like Andrew and Gabriella's house, or a lot of the other tiny houses, if you buy plans, online plans for American tiny houses, you have to cut about 3 ton of weight somewhere. So that's why one of the issues that Australian tiny house people have to face is that they have to really watch the weight, because for those sort of trailers that we build tiny houses on with the ball and the hitch, the absolute limit here is 4,500 kilograms, which is, I think, 9,900 pounds. Now, that includes the trailer plus the house. So as you can imagine, if you've got a 30-foot trailer sitting in your garden like we do out the back, that's a real balancing act. We need to look at every component that goes into that house. Not only what does it cost, but how much does that weigh? Is that going to be too heavy? And we're going to keep the whole thing under 9,900 pounds. So it's going to be an interesting exercise in maths and budgeting weight-wise.
So the sort of original reason for building on a trailer here was a zoning issue, right? And the ability to actually live in it. So the trailer wasn't a part of the original concept that became a necessity, and then now is really identified with tiny houses. Do you have the same zoning restrictions that make putting it on a trailer a solution?
Pretty much. That's really the only way, because like many countries around the world, if you want to build, even if you own your own land, if you want to build a tiny little house on a foundation, you need to go through get council permits, or like your local municipality. You need to approach them and pay often permitting fees. Then you have to submit your proposal. This is what we'd like to do. please, can we do it? And they'll either say, yes, you may, or no, you may not. And depending on what your design is, they might say, no, that doesn't meet minimum ceiling, or there's minimum ceiling height requirements, or minimum habitable sized rooms. There's certain, in Australia, there's certain minimum height that 80% of your ceilings must meet, or there's a certain minimum distance that your toilet must be from your kitchen sink, and all these sort of things. And so if you want a really small house, and maybe you're quite happy with a small house, odds are that it's not going to be approved. And therefore, not only there's the cost involved at the time, it could take up to 12 months to submit your plans, get them approved. And so really, by having it on a trailer, same issue as the States, by having it on a trailer, it's no longer a building or a structure. It's not a permanent structure. It's on wheels. Therefore, building codes, council permits, they don't apply. It's very similar to building your own caravan or travel trailers, like a self-built travel trailer, really, is what they would be classed as in Australia. And perfect example of that was a guy here in Australia, in Melbourne, who built a tiny house in the front garden of his in-laws' place. And his name was Fred, American guy actually, Fred Schultz. And I went over to see Fred, and he said, yeah, we had the building inspectors come around from the local council. And the neighbours complained. They said, oh, this guy's building some sort of shed or house in his front garden. And so the building inspectors came around, but he said as soon as they walked in the front gate, and as soon as they saw that it was on wheels, they knew where their job started and where their job ended. And so the conversation then turned to, oh, isn't it great? Can we have a look through? What have you done? How have you done it? So, yeah, so that's really the advantage of putting it on, and the reason why everyone's putting it on trailers here, mainly to get around the whole building codes and council permits. But secondly, also for the flexibility, just being able to move it. And I was discussing with my partner Lisa the other day, if we won the lottery and we had a beautiful bit of land and we were owning it and we were never going to move it, I would still put the house on a trailer, just for the sole reason of you've got that ability to move it around the property. In the winter we'll put it over under the trees, or in the full sun, and in the summer we can park it under the trees. So that's one of the reasons I love the fact that it's on wheels.
So here, at least, it's pretty common that there are restrictions of how long you can stay in the equivalent of an RV living. So do you face the same thing in Australia, that there are time limits?
Yeah, there is time limits, and it depends on the state that you're in, because Australia has like different states and territories, and then within that, each state, you've got different council regions. And so similar to the States, I guess, as well. But for example, in Queensland, up in the northern part of Australia, it is legal to live in a caravan full time. So whether it's a proper traditional caravan travel trailer or one of these self-built tiny house caravans, it is actually legal to live full time in a caravan in the back garden of an established house. Whereas down here in Melbourne, no, you can't do that. You can do it for you can maybe get a permit to do it for maybe 28 days. It varies around each state. So some places it might be no more than 28 days. For some places it might be no more than 28 days, 28 nights over the course of a year. But then my argument has always been, how do they police that? And so what most people are doing, the people that are actually doing this, that have built a tiny house, what they've done is they've got that sort of renegade sort of streak about them, and they've just done it, and they haven't told the council. Because the majority of tiny house people, I think part of the whole tiny house mindset is they also want to get out of the rat race and sort of extract themselves from the system. And so for a lot of people building a tiny house, they don't actually want to be shoved in the backyard of an inner city suburban garden. They want to be on the fringe of the city with some land. They want to be able to wake up and see trees and a few fields. And you can do that in Australia. You don't have to go 4 hours out in the country. You can live on the fringe of a major city, and there's acreage properties. So a lot of people have just made a cash in hand private arrangement, a rental arrangement with a landowner, whether it's a family friend or someone they met at the bar, or all through social media or word of mouth contacts. And so they might find a farmer with a field that they're not using, and hey, Mr. Farmer, I'll pay you $400 a month cash or whatever if I can park my little tiny house in the corner of your field. And they just don't tell the council. And because it's on private land, if the neighbours can't see it, if you can't see it from the road, it could be years before the council even finds out that you're there. And even if they do find out, they would then have to prove that someone's living there. And that requires the local council to actually trespass on your land to actually prove somehow that someone's living there. So yeah, a lot of people are just sort of doing it and not telling the council. But there's always going to be some that want to be able to do it and live in a city in the backyard, almost like in Australia we call them granny flats. In America, I think are they ADRs? No, the little dwellings that you have in the back of
accessory dwellings.
Accessory dwellings, yes. So we have some of them in Australia. They're called granny flats, where and again, even the rules of those vary state to state. In New South Wales, you're allowed to have a granny flat in your backyard, subject to council approval if you get the design and everything approved. But the only person that can live there, they've got to be directly related to the family, and it's got to be a care type situation. Whereas other states, it's not a requirement. So, so I think it's legal in New South Wales, but not down here. So again, every state's different in Australia, but gradually the ideas will change, I think, and as more and more people do it.
What's the size of a home in Australia?
The what? Sorry,
the size of an average traditional home.
Look, Australia at the moment has actually the largest homes on the planet. Our average new home that's being built out there in suburbia is 243 square metres, which I think is about 2,600 square feet, I calculated the other day. So that's the average size of your new houses that are being sold out there. And people are buying these. People are buying these houses, and they're getting them built, and they're going into massive debt to live in this beautiful new house that's 1.5 hours drive from where they work, or an hour out of the city, way out in the outer suburbs, because that's all they can afford. Because one of the issues, again, I'm sure like America, but in Australia, the average price of a house now is $695,000. The average mortgage that was written in Australia last year was $472,000, I think, and the figure that really shocks me the most is the very first home loan. So young Australians, the first home loan that young Aussies are going out there and getting last year was $323,000. Now that's, it's like, you've got the great American dream. We've got our big, the big Australian dream is to grow up and to buy your own piece of property and own a house and land. And that great Australian dream for many people is just becoming impossible now, because how can a young Australian firstly save up? They've got to live somewhere and pay rent and pay the bills and put food on the table, but they've got to somehow also save up on the side $150,000 to $200,000 as a deposit for a property, and then go into a $300,000 debt for the next 30 years. And so for a lot of people, it's just impossible. And so that's why people are looking at options.
Yeah, I think there's stories are similar here. I think we have the addition of the student loan crisis. Do students in Australia leave university with the same kind of debt American students do?
So no, not anywhere near the debt. They do have a debt. We've got this system called HEX, or at least that they did when I went through university. And so there is a debt, but over the course of, I did a 4-year university degree, I did a double degree, and when I came out, my debt was about $35,000, but that only gets paid back. You only have to pay that back to the government once you're actually in a job, and it sort of comes out of your tax every year when you do your tax. And so you don't really notice it, but there's a minimum level. You don't have to start paying anything back until you reach a minimum sort of threshold, and then you start paying it out of your tax. But it's minimal. It's not really a major issue, no. But there is a bit of a debt. So thankfully we don't have these huge student debts and student loans to pay off as well.
So one of the interesting benefits of marketing the summit through Facebook is that I get to see the demographics of those who like the page. You probably have the same thing on your Facebook page.
Yeah.
And fascinatingly, the largest cohort of people liking the page are middle-aged women.
Absolutely.
Same thing going on in Australia?
Yep. Out of our almost 41,000 followers, we have 69% of our followers are female. And I think the largest chunk, last time I looked, was about 19% of those are female between the age of 35 to 50. So that's, middle-aged women, vastly the largest amount of followers. And it's very similar to other people that I'm connected with that run tiny house related pages as well. I've checked with them and they've got similar sort of numbers. So 60 to 70% female.
Fascinating. Okay, so part of the story here that you haven't mentioned there is the sort of the do-it-yourself aspect of tiny houses. And I personally, I think this relates to the way in which a lot of students leave the current education system feeling like they're not capable of doing something independent. And the tiny house movement sort of has this ethos of you can actually do it. These things that you're told are only can be done by professionals. You could actually do it. It will take time. You have to learn it, but you could actually build your own house. Is that also a part of the appeal there?
Absolutely. It's a very empowering feeling because you can imagine if the average mum and dad would say, right, I'm going to build my own house. It's going to be 2 levels and 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. It's a really daunting sort of task. But the fact that people can see, hey, I can actually do this. And when they see other people that have built their own tiny house, they say, yeah, I can actually do this. Can't be that hard. It's really what we're talking about with a tiny house. It's a big shoebox. It's a big box with a couple of shelves, really, because the loft's like a big shelf. So it's a big box with a shelf. I can do that. And in fact, we've run Tiny Houses Australia. Have run several tiny house building workshops. There was a builder we worked with a couple of years ago, and we did several tiny house building hands-on workshops, and that was good. And we are going to be running some more workshops this year and next year as well. But up until now, the vast majority, well, the only option for people in Australia if they wanted a tiny house was to DIY their own build, because unlike America, in America now there's probably close on 100 or more tiny house building companies that are where you can go to and say, I want a tiny house. Can you guys do it for me? And, starting off with, tumbleweed and they went from there. But in Australia, there really has been no commercially operating tiny house building companies. And so the only option was people to DIY their own house, and that's fine. And there always will be that aspect. In the last 12 months or so, there's now 2 tiny house building companies that are up and running. That's the growth, and I'm sure more tiny house building companies will get up and running over time. But yeah, the DIY aspect is certainly very important, and I think a lot of people like that challenge, and they want to have that sense of achievement to know, I did it, I built my own house. And it's a lot cheaper as well if you DIY your own house as well.
So it's interesting here. I went to the Florida Tiny House Festival, and they made a point of bringing tiny living people from a variety of circumstances that are not just tiny houses. So they had 6 or 7 converted school buses, and they had, I'm trying to remember if they had a boat. I don't think they actually had a boat, but in fact, a lot of people who live on houseboats live minimally or tiny. People who live in RVs. But there's not much of a crossover here in terms of conversation. So there's the tiny house community and discussion, there's the RV living, and they don't really overlap much. Do you see overlap there?
Not so much, but I would imagine, just like there's huge tiny house on a trailer communities. I'm sure there's massive online Facebook groups and pages for houseboat communities and living in a van, van life communities. In Australia here, I think there's not much of a crossover, only because the movement's so small, and that will grow. I mean, there's people in our tiny houses Australia community that I know that are building like shipping container houses. They're not doing it on a trailer. They're doing shipping container houses. People that are converting vans or buses, or maybe doing house trucks. So there is a little bit of a crossover, but from day one, I've always promoted Tiny Houses Australia as not just being about on a trailer. Yes, in the tiny house movement, when people talk about a tiny house, they generally think of a tumbleweed style cutesy little house on a trailer. But the fact is that when people talk about living tiny or going tiny, it could be a yurt, it could be a house truck, or living in a converted bus, or it could be just a really small micro studio apartment where they really use the space well. So as Jay Schaefer once said in an interview, it's about having the space that you need. I mean, the wheels, as you said, came about through the zoning requirements and a way to skirt the zoning requirements. But yeah, tiny living could be all sorts of different ways. There's a couple actually here in Melbourne that I know who built a tiny house, and they spent 12 months living in a tent in a field off the grid as a way of practicing, and while they saved up for their tiny house build. And my partner and I, we spent 12 months living in a 1974 15-foot vintage caravan or vintage travel trailer. So that was our experiment in tiny living.
Do you consider yourself a minimalist?
I do, because I'm training my partner to be a minimalist, but I consider myself a minimalist. I mean, when I sort of moved out of the family home, when I sort of left the marriage, I took my laptop, my phone, my camera, my clothes. That was about it. And so when I left that situation, and once I moved in with my partner Lisa into this vintage caravan, there's just not a lot of space. So we decided we're just going to buy what we actually need. And so, we did the trip to IKEA, and we bought, 4 plates, 4 bowls, 4 cups, that kind of thing. But it was great, and we loved it. And it's been a big awakening call for us to when you realize what stuff you actually need, what things do you actually need, and it's surprisingly little. And even though we've gone back to renting a big house, like a normal house, we didn't really want to, but we wanted a place where we didn't want to live somewhere and then have a build site where we had to, on the weekends, drive up to the build site. So we wanted to build where we lived. And so in this house that we're renting at the moment, it's in a town about an hour north of Melbourne. And so we went back and we rented a house. It's on a corner block. There's double gates at the back where we can get our 30-foot trailer into the backyard. And so we're going to be building Lisa's tiny house in the backyard. And then once it's complete, then we can move it out. So it's going to be an interesting turn of events. But because of that, and because the view has been, okay, going into a regular house is just a temporary measure while we build, we're still making sure we don't buy any stuff we don't need. So,
is there a noticeable minimalism movement in Australia?
To be honest, not really. I think the majority of Australians still have that attitude of, or the overt sort of attitude that's out there in society is, it's still that bigger is better, more is better, that commercialized, buy more stuff mentality. Like in America, we're constantly surrounded by media advertising things that you don't need and spend money on this. And a lot of people, the people in the tiny house movement are realizing that life's not so much about stuff. But is it obvious that there's a minimalist movement? No, not really. It's very much a niche. But you do come across people that are realizing, that are sort of seeing the light and going down that path of, I just don't need that stuff. I'd rather spend my money on my passions and travel, or spending time with people I care about.
What's been the impact of the financial crisis in Australia, and how is that related to if it has related to the growth of tiny homes?
Look, I think in terms of the financial crisis, I think there's always been a financial crisis for people every year in Australia. There's always people that are struggling, regardless of whether the economy is doing well or not. And so, you know, people are in different situations. People are coming out of long-term relationships. People are coming back from, you know, business collapses or bad investments. And so a lot of people are in different financial situations. But the thing that's pretty much remained constant is the property market. And in Australia, like in America, you're either paying a mortgage or you're paying rent. You know, we've got one of those two camps. And mortgage, you know, house prices and rents have been going up and up and up over the last 20 years. And in some ways, it's kind of more, I think it's, obviously the cost of living changes. You know, 20 years ago, mortgages were much smaller, but then the average incomes were a lot smaller. The price of groceries and things were totally different as well. But it's always going to be hard for people. And it's people that are making a dramatic change in the way things are done by doing things like, well, I'm going to build a tiny house on a trailer. Those are the people that I think are going to get ahead, because if you just follow what society says, you know, is the normal thing to do, you know, you grow up and then you go to college or university and then you get a job and then you get a home loan and then you pay off, you know, you start paying the mortgage, and then when you build up a bit of equity in your house, then you remodel the kitchen and spend $40,000, or then you put in a pool, you know, or you sell the house and you move to a better suburb and you upgrade. And a lot of people are starting to realize that having made it and being successful and happy is not so much about the suburb that you live in, or what's your postcode or zip code, or, you know, what's the badge on the front of your car. People are starting to realize that, you know, there's other things that are maybe more important.
So I want to see if an impression I've had of Australia is accurate. So I've been there a couple of times to speak for educational events, and I got the impression that in the United States, we measure our success often by our job title, and where we are. And I had this impression in Australia that wasn't as significant a measure of people. Like the janitor at the conference event came up and actually participated in the conversation that was going on. And I thought, well, that wouldn't have happened at a conference in the United States.
Sure.
Did I just hit some unique circumstances, or is there actually sort of a difference in terms of how people see their status based on their job?
I think there's sort of two camps, and some may disagree with me, but for some people, yeah, there's that elitist sort of what do you do? You know, often when you meet people at a party or at a function, hi, you know, my name's Darren, you know, so what do you do? You know, and like, what's your job? And I don't know if people ask that just because they've got no other thing to think of to ask. But a lot of people, I think, still judge people based on their occupation. If someone says, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, you know, they get a different impression of someone than if they say, I drive a garbage truck, you know. So there's a different impression there. But what I do notice in Australia is that people, when they meet others, yes, they might judge them partially on what their role is when they find out what their occupation is. But more than that, I think Aussies tend to take people at face value and what sort of person are you, and how can I relate to you? So that's why if you go to a bar or you go to a function, you can have doctors talking to garbage collectors, or, you know, that's if you're a good bloke and you're having a drink with someone and you're getting on with them well. That's the most important thing for Australians, I think. If you've got a bad attitude, or if you've got this elitist sort of I'm better than you attitude, then it's probably the same in the States. You're not going to get very far with people and you're not going to have many friends. But that initial being willing to talk to people, I think that's maybe a little bit more open in Australia.
Yeah, I've noticed the same thing in Brazil, and both cultures have a history of sort of being a place where outcasts went. And I've wondered if that actually had a part of the story. So I guess the connection I wanted to make was how much of an individual's status in Australia is associated with their house or their financial circumstance?
I think a lot of it, I mean, the point we just touched on was how important is your occupation. I mean, some people judge you on that, but what really is judged, I think, in Australia is and what sort of people judge what sort of person you are based on, you know, the clothes that you wear. There's still that very sort of shallow sort of judgment that people make when they look at someone's driving an expensive looking car or they live in a nice big house. Oh, they must be very successful. They must have made it. But often they don't know that these people are under enormous financial pressure. They might have debt up to their eyeballs, and they're probably miserable as well. So I think there's going to be a long while before the situation changes where people don't focus on, oh, it doesn't matter what sort of car you drive or what sort of house you live in. But by the same token, when I've mentioned to people that I'm building a tiny house on a trailer, people are now starting to see, because in the mainstream media, there's shows like Tiny House Nation and Tiny Luxury and a couple of others that have been shown on TV here in Australia. And so now when I mention tiny houses, you know, I was at work, I have a day job separate to the tiny house community, and I was at work yesterday and I was with a client and I was mentioning tiny houses, and the lady said, oh, that's those things. I've seen them on the television. Yeah, they're so cute. I like those. So more and more people are at least starting to hear about them. And so when I mention that I'm going to be downsizing and building a tiny house on a trailer, and I don't get that, oh, you know, almost like, oh, are you homeless? But the reaction I get now is more, oh, that's so cute. That's a good idea. And so they're more interested in the idea. So I think attitudes are slowly changing, but the overall image in Australia is still more is better, bigger is better. And if you've got an expensive car, then you must have made it, which we all know, like in the States, is a fallacy.
Okay, so 12 months in the Vintage Caravan. What were the biggest lessons?
It was an exercise for us. It was an interesting exercise for us because it was a new relationship as well, because my partner Lisa and I had been together for about 6 months before we moved in, but it was a long distance relationship. She was about 150 mile away in her hometown. And so it was we met a couple of times, but it was, by the time we moved into the Vintage Caravan, I think we had met 12 times. And she's nodding. So we'd met 12 times. And so we figured, well, if this is what we think it is, this is going to work. And why on earth are we waiting? But if this is not going to work and it's all going to end in tears, then we're going to find out real fast. And so, because like as you guys know, you know, a 15-foot travel trailer is not big. And the actual floor area where you can walk around was about 8 feet by 3 feet. And that was our little floor area. And so one of the lessons I learned early on was if Lisa got up to get changed or to do it, whatever, to cook dinner or make a coffee, she said, sit down, I've got the floor. And so we had to sort of have turns at using the floor space of the house. We would have liked maybe another 6 feet of length on the caravan. That would have made things a bit more comfortable, but it's doable. I mean, we didn't have a bathroom or a shower. So we were parked in the driveway of a residential house. It was actually one of my long-term Facebook followers. Shout out to Rob if he's watching. And Rob approached us when we made it public that we were going to buy a caravan and we were looking for a place to park. He said, mate, you can park in my driveway. And so we plugged into the power in his garage, and if we needed the shower or bathroom, you know, we used the shower in the main house. So it was great. We saved an enormous amount of rent. It was a big help for us. But it was an experiment in, could we live in a small space, which is far smaller than the tiny house we're planning, and not actually want to kill each other? And the relationship survived. She still does want to kill me sometimes, but it was an exercise in, and it was a realization for us both of what we actually do need. And it's not in terms of things and utensils and pots and pans and things. You don't really need a lot, but yeah, we need a little bit more space than 15 foot, I think.
So aside from recognizing you needed more space, are there other ways that you changed the design of the home you're building based on that year?
Well, we're building a couple of tiny houses because, and there's my story and my partner's story is a little bit different, but when I first met Lisa, one of the great advantages about my Lisa is that I never had to convince her of the merits of a tiny house. No, it'll be good, I promise. Look, what about this idea? Let's move into a tiny house. Because I met Lisa through my Facebook page. She was one of my Facebook followers. And I remember it was December 1st, 2014. 14? Yes, she's nodding. So December 1st, 2014, and Lisa is an artist, and she put a photo up of her planned tiny house. It was a little model. And I thought, that's really cute. What's that? And I started talking to her, and then, by the 13th, I had her phone number, and by the 26th, we'd met, and her life has never been the same since. But when she put her model up there, that's sort of what caught my attention. But so she had her tiny house plan already in place, and she knew, this is what I'm building. And I remember speaking to her, and one of my standard questions, which still is one of my standard questions, whenever I come across a person building a tiny house with a loft, I ask them, how big's your ceiling? How tall's your ceiling downstairs? Because I want to see, like in America, there's maximum height requirements. So I wanted to see, well, how much is she going to have in her loft? Because as we all know, that the more space and vertical height we can get in a loft, the better, right? So I said, what's your ceiling height downstairs? And she said, 5'3". I said, shit, how big are you? And she said, I'm 5'1". I said, well, okay, that works. And so she'd really taken to heart this concept of building and designing your tiny house to suit you and your needs and your dimensions. So we have negotiated, and we've adjusted her ceiling height to 6 foot now, because I'm not huge. I'm 5'7", but we've adjusted it so I can fit in there. But we're building Lisa's house first, and so the 30-foot trailer at the back garden is Lisa's house. So we are very much together, but she had her plans in place, and I want her to, I'm going to help her, of course, but it's going to be her project, her house, and I want her to see her project through. Aside from that, I've got my own tiny house design that's in the wings. But the trouble is that both Lisa's design and my design are about 30 foot long, 9 meters long. And these are big, they're heavy. And the only way we're going to be able to move these is to get a dirty great big tow truck. And it's going to be about $1,000 every time we move each of the houses. And so because of the growth of Tiny Houses Australia, and because of the opportunities that have been offered to us as our following has grown, I've actually put my plans on the shelf for a little while. So we're still going to be building Lisa's house first. But one of the big projects for this year, which we haven't really announced yet, is that we're going to be building a official Tiny Houses Australia display house. So we're going to do a lighter single level design around about probably 24 foot long. And we're going to design that as a bit of a showcase to show the Australian public that, yes, this is what a tiny house could look like. You can actually live in it. This is a comfortable space. You've got a good kitchen, bathroom, living room, etc. But the trouble is we need to try and keep this display house that's small. We're going to have to keep it light. So we're going to have to keep it under 7,700 pounds, which is this limit where we can more easily tow it around, because we've been invited to home shows, festivals. I'm speaking on stage at a sustainability festival next weekend. And they said, have you got a tiny house that you can bring? I said, mate, you're 12 months too early. If we were having this conversation 12 months from now, I'd say, sure, I'll bring my house. So we've got a couple of projects on the go. So we've got a 9 meter plus a 7 meter build. It's in the works.
So that's the Melbourne show you're talking about.
Yeah, so the Melbourne home show. We were on stage again. So we were approached sort of mid last year by the organisers to speak on stage about the tiny house movement. As soon as we did our first presentation on day one, the director sat down and said, "We want you in Sydney." So we went up to Sydney to speak on stage there. So and we got a great reception. It was really just about talking to the public about and just introducing this idea of what a tiny house is. I always, at each of my presentations on stage, I would get a show of hands. Who's actually heard it? Does anyone know what a tiny house is? And more people are starting to put their hands up. So, but it was about spreading the word and letting more people know that the advantages, what the advantages are of a tiny house, and the disadvantages, because there are some disadvantages, as we know. but it was a good opportunity, and yeah, we're getting more and more offers of, can you come to this festival, that expo, that, you know, to talk about tiny houses. So lots of things happening.
So have you noticed anything about the American tiny home movement being a little bit removed by being in Australia? When you look at the movement, what are some things that you see that you think we may not see about the movement here?
I think people are, because a lot of the tiny house information is really American based. Yeah, people are scouring, you know, YouTube for tiny house tours and ideas, and as we are as well. I know that my personal, not the display house, but my personal tiny house plan that I've got in place, I've nicked, you know, I've stolen Vina Listato's toilet design from Soul House Design. I've taken other people's, you know, this person's bathroom and that person's kitchen idea, and mashed it all together. But apart from the design side of things, the reasons why people are wanting to go tiny are very similar. A lot of the design ideas are very similar. There's some very, very clever tiny house designs that I've seen. There's a guy who's actually a Kiwi like me, a New Zealander, here in Melbourne building a tiny house, and we've only just discovered his Facebook page about 3 days ago. And he's got what looks like to be quite a large tiny house he's building on a trailer, and he's got 2 sections of wall that just open up to a deck that just open up the entire side of the house. And so some very, very clever designs. But yes, so the design side of things and the reasons why people are doing it is very similar. The thing that's different is, as we touched on earlier, because every man and his dog, so I know it's probably a generalization, but it seems like everyone in America has got one of these big Dodge Ram trucks or Ford F-350 trucks that can pull a mountain. And so you can build a tiny house that's, you know, 17,000 pounds in the States and pull it as long as you got the truck. Whereas in Australia here, those sort of trucks are very, very expensive. I remember Jenna and Guillaume from Tiny House Giant Journey, when they first built their 24-foot tumbleweed, and they were going to do the road trip around the States, and they bought their truck. They said, we've got our truck. We paid $22,000 for it. And I did a search online here in Australia, and I said, guys, that exact same year, make and model in Australia, there's 4 of them available, and the cheapest one's $85,000, you know. And so not a lot of people have those sort of vehicles that can tow that sort of weight. Realistically, those sort of vehicles are tow trucks here in Australia. So the commercial, you know, 4-wheel drive SUVs, you know, light trucks that the average Australian has, things like your Ford Raiders, your Ford Rangers, or Toyota Hiluxes, they can tow up to around 3,500 kilograms, which is 7,700 pounds. And so that limits sort of the design options. So when we look at things, some of the tiny house designs in the States, or when we look at shows like Tiny Luxury, now I love Tiny Heirloom and the work that they do, but we see people in the States doing tiny houses where they've got concrete benches and granite this and marble tiles and the things that we just can't even look at in Australia because of the weight issue. So we have to look at, and the challenge for myself and Lisa, not only with her build, but with our display house, and for anyone that wants to have a really nice tiny house, is that there's that balance between building something that looks really good and it looks like a nice quality house, but doesn't look like a cheap plasticky sort of, not like a cheapo house. And so there's that fine line between quality. You want something to look quality, but we also have to keep an eye on the weight aspect as well.
Aside from the weight and building lighter houses, are there any other design elements or ways of doing things in Australia that you think might end up kind of crossing the ocean and getting adopted in other countries?
I think so. I think a lot of it's very climate dependent as well. I know the traditional, I mean, like the very first tiny house that we saw, Proto House, or Jay Schaefer's original house, you know, with the A-frame peaked roof. A lot of the reasons for that, apart from the aesthetics, is to shed snow in the winter. Now, you know, we're not in Montana, you know, we don't have 6 feet of snow and all that. I hope to hell it snows in Montana. Anyway, we don't have all these massive snowfalls in Australia. And so really in Australia, the issue is more about how to keep the heat out rather than how to keep the heat in the colder parts of the States. So for a lot of the tiny house designs in the States and here in Australia, it kind of depends on the climate. I know with my personal design, I've got bifold windows and that open the place up, and bifold doors. I want to open the place up to the indoor outdoors as much as possible. Whereas if I lived in Alaska, that'd be crazy to do that because most of the year you want to keep everything sort of enclosed and warm. So there is some interesting designs, and the fact that you don't have to meet building codes and you don't have to submit your designs to council and get them approved gives people that design freedom, which is another reason why people love tiny houses. It gives people that design freedom to create a really unusual space that suits them. I mean, a perfect example is Murray Goodchild from the Tall Tiny on Facebook, a friend of mine here in Melbourne. Now, he built his tiny house. Murray, if I've got the figures wrong, forgive me, but he built his entire tiny house. He's done, he's finished, he's living in it with his wife and daughter, and he spent a total of about $12,000, which is crazy here in Australia because the cost of materials, and that's one of the other big things. I remember when Derek Diedrichsen from Relax Shacks, when he came over to Sydney last year, the year before, to do a workshop in Sydney, he was looking around the salvage yards in Sydney, for scrap, as he does, to use recycled and upcycled materials. And he said to me, he was quite shocked at the cost even of old salvage materials here in Australia. And I know that in the US, you can go buy from a myriad of trailer companies, for example, you can go buy a brand new 30-foot tiny house trailer, might cost you $3,500, $4,000. Now, even things like the trailers here, our trailers that we sell average between $6,000 to $10,000. So for our trailer that's out in the garden, that's a $10,000 trailer. So the cost is quite a lot higher. So for Murray, my friend, to have built his entire house for $11,000 is a very creative design. Never seen anything like it. He's got a whole section of wall that opens up to open up the entire side of his house. We're actually due to go out and do a tiny house tour, so stay tuned, people, for a tiny house tour of Murray's house. But he used recycled and upcycled everything. He used fence palings from the neighbouring farm to do part of the siding of his house and a tabletop. He's used, tree branches as a stair railing as you go up the stairs. Very, very unusual design. But yeah, the ability to not, or the lack of the requirement to submit plans, and the fact that a tiny house in Australia is never going to meet building codes. They're never going to meet minimum ceiling height requirements. So it gives people the freedom to say, well, let's be creative and design what we want. And I remember an interview I saw online with Jay Schaefer, and he said that building a tiny house is very much like getting a tailor-made suit. You design it to meet your dimensions and your needs and wants and desires and lifestyle. So if you want to build a tiny house and have half of it as kitchen because you love to cook, then do it. If you want to have a massive wall-sized TV because you love your movies, then do it. And so I think people are very attracted to that sort of idea.
Darren, thank you.
No, it's been a pleasure to talk. I mean, as you can probably tell, I can talk for a week on this topic. So there's so many aspects to it, but it's good to see that the interest is growing, and it just makes sense for so many people, and so many types of people as well. Not just, as I said, so many different types of people are looking at this option. People coming out of a divorce, people coming out of business or financial collapse, people that are maybe got some physical limitations or illnesses where they can't work. I mean, as we discussed, it's hard enough for people to handle a mortgage or rent, even if they're able-bodied and working full-time. So some people just aren't in that situation of being able to work full-time. Young professionals, people out of college or university as they're starting their career, they might want to use a tiny house as a stepping stone. So there's so many different types of people that are looking at this. Older people where the kids have grown up and left the nest, and they're still very independent. So there's lots of options, and lots of different people are looking at the tiny house option, which is encouraging to see because it just makes sense for everyone. It enables people to have more life.
Hey, really fun to have you on. Thank you.
No problem at all. Been a pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure is ours. Okay. Thank you, Darren.
No worries. We'll speak to you guys soon. Cheers.
Cheers.